Let me say welcome, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Chris Campbell, and I work at the Center for National Legal Studies in Salzburg, Austria. We are honored that Arbitration has invited us to host this topical debate on third-party funding. Over the past 10 to 15 years, third-party funding has emerged as a hot-button issue, especially in the context of investor-state arbitration. Whether you think TPF is the best thing since sliced bread, a bland and innocuous device to keep the tasty part of the sandwich off your fingers, a public health hazard, or perhaps that lawyers themselves have been slicing bread for a long time, I'm sure that our stellar panel will serve up something for you. Before our debate moderators introduce our stars, Brooke, Jeffery, Diogo, and Victoria, let me introduce to you our moderators. First, we have Kabir Duggal. He is a senior international arbitration advisor in Arnold Porter's International Arbitration and Public International Law practice groups in New York. He focuses on international investment arbitration, international commercial arbitration, and public international law matters. Kabir is also a lecturer at Columbia Law, and I can attest to his jaunty lectures and jovial PowerPoints, but I suspect opposing counsel will consider him to be more of a laughing assassin. Our other moderator is Ishan Madan. He's an advocate with some 10 years experience in complex litigation and arbitration, and a 2019 graduate of the White & Case International Arbitration LLM program at the University of Miami. Ishan will be admitted as an attorney in New York soon, and he is the founder of Arbitration. I'm not sure if Ishan's virtual background was carefully designed to visualize that short bio, or just to conceal all the bundles in his office, but maybe he'll show us later what's in the background. So with that, Ishan, Kabir, the stage is yours.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. Indeed, this is a hot topic. Third-party funding has, over the years, become an extremely important and critical tool. Critical because it assists in access to justice for those who can't afford it, or they prefer to use their limited liquidity and capital to advance business objectives. It is often said, money is power. As Uncle Ben told Peter Parker, with great power comes great responsibility. There have been calls for setting up a regulatory framework in respect of third-party funders within the field of international arbitration. Within those calls for regulations and the access to justice are covered our questions for today's very important debate. We today have speakers who are experts in their respective fields and are here to present different and differing perspectives and arguments in favor of and against the motion. In no particular order, may I introduce them. Diogo Pereira, he's an international lawyer specializing in international arbitration, public international law, and investigations relating to corruption, money laundering sanctions, and terrorist finance. Based out of Washington, D.C., he has a significant experience in Latin America, Europe, the United States, and the Middle East. Professor Victoria Sahani is a professor of law at Arizona State University. She has over a decade of experience in international commercial arbitration, investment treaty arbitration, and on-to-late dispute resolution. Professor Sahani is a member of the ICCA Queen Mary Task Force on Third-Party Funding in International Arbitration and has made key contributions to the development of models to structure third-party funding. Brooke Güven is a renowned researcher from the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment. Her work focuses on analyzing the contracts, domestic frameworks, and international legal arrangements governing cross-border investments and the impacts that these frameworks have on sustainable development objectives. She has been working extensively on analyzing the impacts of third-party funding. Jeffery Commission is a director at Burford Capital with responsibility for overseeing Burford's underwriting and investment activity in investor state and international commercial arbitrations. Mr. Commission is an authority in the field of international arbitration, having more than 15 years of experience representing claimants in both treaty arbitrations and commercial disputes. He has authored several articles and books, including the soon-to-be-released Third-Party Funding in International Arbitration, Law and Practice. Now to introduce the debate, I invite Kabir.
Thank you, Ishan, and thank you to our fabulous panelists. Welcome, everybody. Good morning, afternoon, evening, night, based on whichever part of the world you are. We are delighted to have you. And today promises to be a very, very fun debate. The motion that we have is that this House believes that third-party funding and investor-state arbitration is the best thing after sliced bread. As you've just heard, we have 4 panelists with diverse experience, with divergent experience, that are going to debate this topic. And we've created 2 teams. One team that's going to argue in support of the motion and one against the motion. Let me just make one initial comment. This is going to go on YouTube and live in perpetuity. My initial comment is that we're going to apply the Chatham House rules. And by that, I mean what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, what happens on Zoom stays in Zoom. The views that the panelists will talk about may or may not represent their real positions. Do not hold it against them unless they tell you to do so. Okay, so in support of the motion, we're going to have Professor Victoria Sahani and Jeffery Commission. They're going to argue in support of the motion. The other 2 speakers, Brooke, Güven, and Diogo Pereira, they're going to argue against the motion. How are we going to go about this? We're going to go about this first by beginning with opening arguments. Each presenter will make their opening arguments for 5 minutes, right? We will first have the team arguing in support of the motion, then against the motion, then we're back to the team arguing in support, and we end with the team against the motion. 1.5 minutes into the discussion, you will hear a ding. Everybody should hear it. That is an indication from Ishan that 1.5 minutes remain for our panelists to end their statement. At 5 minutes, you will see Ishan dancing. When Ishan starts dancing, that is an indication the time is up, right? We're going to have our opening statements for 20 minutes in total, 5 minutes each. We're then going to have a question and answer session. We invite you to put your questions using the chat function, using the Q&A function. We will also be putting a few polls for you just to see our audience reaction. Ishan and I will facilitate this question and answers. We will likely not be able to get through all the questions, but we still welcome them. Zoom becomes a lot more fun when audience get in it, and we invite you to do that. After we have the question and answers for around 20 to 30 minutes, we will have closing arguments for 2 to 3 minutes, right? That's going to be our debate. We have 4 fantastic speakers. I know each of them. I'm privileged to call all of them my friends. You are all in for a real treat. With that, let's begin with the opening statements. And let me just repeat the motion. The motion is, this House believes that third-party funding in investor-state arbitration is the best thing after sliced bread. Opening statements in support of the motion, Professor Victoria Sahani. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Duggal, and I'm so pleased to be here. And hello to all of you around the world. Thank you for tuning in and joining us for this discussion. So I am arguing for the motion. And I'd first like to say that sliced bread is quite delicious. So third-party funding has some competition there if it's going to be the best thing after sliced bread. I will say that third-party funding is part of the fabric of arbitration. It is here to stay. It's actually been here for decades. We may only recently have discovered third-party funding, but it's been going on for at least 30 years. If you go all the way back to the beginnings of the industry in Australia. So this is not something new. This is not something that's just come up. It's been around. I wanted to give a quick introduction in terms of what's going on right now in the field. sort of laying this groundwork for saying this is here and it's here to stay. And not only are we as practitioners and academics seeing third-party funding, but also the regulators and the arbitral institutions are also aware of it and are paying attention and are starting to incorporate it, which sort of even further entrenches third-party funding in the fabric of arbitration. So I'll quickly say what the arbitral institutions are doing as a sort of around the world tour, and then quickly a few other jurisdictions, national jurisdictions, and what they're doing. And so first I'll say, since this is a debate that's primarily focused on investment treaty arbitration, I'll start with ICCID, but you should know that third-party funding, of course, occurs in commercial arbitration as well. And many of the institutions that address third-party funding are dealing with both commercial and investment. But to focus on investment arbitration for just a moment, ICCID, as you may know, is in the process of its rule revision. And so they undertake this every so often. And so this is a major rule revision for ICCID. And one of the things that they've decided to do is to include a third-party funding rule. The latest version of their working document is up on their website. It's from February 28th. And they have a rule in there that, if adopted, would require disclosure of third-party funding. And what I mean by disclosure is disclosure of the name of the funder, the identity of the funder, and the contact information of the funder. The interesting thing is that not only has ICCID addressed this, but there have actually been some investment treaties that have addressed third-party funding. So we have the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, which is between the EU and Canada. And in Chapter 8, Articles 8.1 and 8.26, there is a disclosure provision and a definition of third-party funding. Again, the disclosure is identity and the name of the funder and the contact information. There's also the EU-Vietnam Investment Protection Agreement that addresses third-party funding in two different sections. Again, disclosure rule there as well. There's also a provision about thinking about third-party funding when looking at security for cost. I don't know if we're going to talk about security for cost, but I just wanted to throw that out there. It says that it can and should be considered. And we also have the draft Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which is not ratified, but the European Commission draft actually has a third-party funding disclosure rule that looks basically identical to CETA. The point I want to make by highlighting these investment treaties as well as highlighting the ICCID rule is that the states are aware of this, and the states who are entering into the treaties, and the states also entering into the ICCID treaties, if they didn't like third-party funding, if they thought it was not the best thing since sliced bread or thought it was horrible, then they could have just said, you know what, we're going to ban it. We're going to ban it in our treaties. We're going to ban it in ICCID, and that is not the position that the states have taken. So I think that is very telling, because this is investment treaty arbitration is a system created by the states, right? It's created by them, managed by them. They can change it if they want. They have decided to wholeheartedly accept third-party funding. Just a couple of institutions I want to mention. CTAC, the China International Economic and Trade Arbitration Commission, actually has some investment arbitration rules. Those took effect in 2017, and they actually have third-party funding in Article 27. And so CTAC also contemplates investment treaty arbitration, and they've defined third-party funding, and they require disclosure. So again, we have this trend. This is an arbitral institution, but the same trend is we know third-party funding is there. We want to have, we want to know about it. We want to know who's funding, and we want to know their contact information. The Singapore International Arbitration Center also mentions third-party funding. As you know, as you may know or may not know, Singapore has legalized third-party funding in international arbitration through law, as well as Hong Kong. Hong Kong has also legalized it. Hong Kong even has a code of conduct for third-party funders. So we have governments getting on board. So with those two examples, saying, you know, third-party funding is here to stay, and here's some regulation. Again, I can't go into great detail given the short time, but I just want to highlight those. We also have the ICC. The ICC is getting on board. I'm on the ICC Commission on Arbitration. The ICC is looking at rule revisions at the moment. We actually have been debating a third-party funding rule. The text is not finalized, so I can't really discuss exactly what the rule will look like, but with the ICC will have a third-party funding rule. I can say that when the new rules come out. And so again, another institution that's addressing this. There are also several institutions that haven't yet changed their rules, but have put out practice notes. They sort of say, under our existing rules, here's how you deal with third-party funding. So the ICC already has a practice note that talks about any entity, I'm quoting here, any entity having a direct economic interest in the dispute or an obligation to indemnify a party for the award. That's how they define third-party funding. In the practice note, it basically says that has to be disclosed. The Brazilian Arbitration and Mediation Center, which goes by the acronym CAM-CCBC, you might have seen that acronym around, they actually have adopted an administrative resolution that requires disclosure of the existence of funding as well as the contact information of the funder. So again, haven't yet changed any rules, but at least are providing guidance. Australia also is on board with this. The Australian government actually has recently decided to require third-party funders to get licenses, an Australian financial services license. That further legitimizes the industry in that country for funders who hold such a license. And you know, I could talk about England and Wales, the United States, thank you for that reminder, and other countries, but I just wanted to sort of lay out a very quick overview of the world map. We just did a world flyover around the world in 5 minutes. And I just wanted to lay that out as an opening statement, because I think it's important to understand what's actually happening if we're going to debate whether or not this is a good thing or not, if third-party funding is good or not. What are people doing? What are states doing? What are institutions doing? What are treaties provisions? How are all of these things addressing or not addressing third-party funding? And in my research for my book, Third-Party Funding in International Arbitration, we looked at over 6 continents, you know, over 80 countries, and there are 60 plus countries that have some sort of regulation of this industry. And so it's important to note that this is here, it is being recognized by governments, and therefore I think it's here to stay. And if they wanted to get rid of it, they could just say, we're going to outlaw it. And a few countries have, like Ireland, for instance. But for the most part, it's been widely accepted. So I will cede my time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Around the world in 5 minutes. We're very grateful for that. Moving from somebody who has done a lot of research to somebody else who has done a lot of research in this field. We're going to have Brooke Güven arguing against the motion. Brooke, I know, you know, just one point. We realize that the ding cannot be heard when somebody is speaking. You have to notice Ishan dancing. That's the cue for us at both stages. We will also give you a few minutes extra just so that, you know, we can you know, have an equal distribution of time. Brooke, the floor is yours.
That's fine. I forget the cues, so just cut me off if you need to. But no, thank you to the organizers for having me here to discuss third-party funding in investor-state dispute settlement. And Victoria, that was a really, really impressive tour of the world.
Thank you.
So I am here to emphatically disagree with the motion of the House. TPF is not the best thing since sliced bread. I'll offer, you know, a gluten-free perspective, if you will. So we all know at the moment, third-party funding in investor-state dispute settlement is effectively unregulated and largely not transparent, and thus it makes it difficult to actually know what is happening with respect to funding and its impacts, to determine those impacts and effects, and to regulate appropriately and respond to any impacts or effects. So much of the discussion and the regulation that Victoria very thoroughly covered focuses more on issues related to conflicts of interest, security for costs, which we may or may not get into later. And the solutions that are proposed to solve these concerns are generally limited to transparency, as we've seen in the ICCID rules and ICCID rule proposals, and then some other regulations that are taking place. So I would assert that these concerns are actually somewhat of red herrings, or maybe merely the tip of the iceberg. Transparency may not actually be considered regulation in any true sense of the word if we were to consider actual impacts and effects. So outside of some of these newer developments, which are welcome, funders are largely not subject to any codes of conduct or other regulated obligations to a claimant, to the arbitration process, or to the process itself, outside of contracts. So they really operate through a profit incentive. So they have contractual rights to influence case strategy or other decisions taken by the claimant. And we have to ask what systemic issues this sort of unregulated profit-seeking capital may introduce into a legal system. And more importantly, whether these impacts are actually impacting the functioning of that legal system in achieving its own objectives. So in this light, whether the benefits of introducing that funding outweigh the costs. So treaty-based investor-state dispute settlement is included in treaties, ostensibly included, I would assume, to advance the object and purpose of the treaties, which is the sustainable economic development of the host states, and by extension, the wide variety of stakeholders within those states, including third-party funders, but many others. So the question then is whether third-party funding advances that objective. So in a paper that myself and my colleague Lisa Johnson published last year, we set forth a few thoughts on this matter. We considered, for example, whether funding would mean that more claims are advanced in certain sectors, namely, for example, extractives, where expectation or early phase damages are more easily secured. We considered whether funders would finance marginal, and I don't call them frivolous, I call them marginal claims, which are intended to push boundaries of the law or the investor-state dispute settlement system itself. So we considered whether funding would impact decisions to settle or other case strategy, and whether the complete or near complete de-risking of an investment, of bringing an investment dispute, would impact decisions by the investor to remain invested or to exit a country. So these questions are of obvious importance if the goal of states is to attract and retain foreign direct investment. So conducting research on this issue is notoriously difficult given the lack of transparency, but there is a general understanding that only a small portion of funded claims are actually publicly known. Small, I'm not sure how many there are, but it's considered small. However, of those known claims, the points that my colleague and I raised seem to be onto something. For example, of known funded claims that have come to a conclusion, 1/3 were denied jurisdiction. So this raises questions as to whether funders are actually funding those sure bets as they claim, or whether they're pushing jurisdictional boundaries of law or fact. And from a practical perspective, the bifurcation of cases at the insistence of a funder or otherwise can be an added cost to respondents. From a policy perspective, pushing boundaries of the law in a funder-friendly direction can impact the intent of the state treaty parties themselves. So similarly, the rate at which extractive sector claims are funded is twice the prevalence in ISDS overall. So this raises questions again about the issue of early phase damages, which are themselves increasing and controversial, and whether they're being driven, at least in part, by funders. Uh-oh, I heard a ding. So we see middle income countries being sued in funded claims at a rate 1/3 higher than they are overall. So this again raises questions about what respondent states are facing funded claims and whether those may be states more likely to settle than high income economies. And all of this raises serious questions about the role of third-party funding in advancing those economic development objectives that the states have. And none of these issues will be solved or addressed through transparency. So of course, there's this access to justice issue, but without more information on the claims, we can't actually know which claimants are accessing funding and for what reasons. And I'm sure Victoria could speak to this more knowledgeably, but the ICCA Queen Mary report does suggest that access to justice may again be somewhat misleading, and that what we're really talking about is access to ISDS at a cost less expensive than other alternatives. I think that was my time, Sean.
30 seconds more.
Okay. So I would say as a final point, in the context of the global economic fallout of COVID-19, we will see liquidity in other markets decrease, and we're naturally going to see an increase in institutional and other investors reallocating funds to markets like litigation finance, where there are higher returns. So if capital is being pushed into this market, there's obviously going to be pressure to deploy it and to invest in claims. So one could say that under COVID, countries may have violated treaties. It then becomes a policy question as to how limited funds of debt-constrained countries should be allocated, who should be winning and who should be losing. So I think this is a very timely debate. So thank you for having it. And I'll cede the rest of my time and maybe we can discuss some of this a bit more later.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We have heard one person arguing in support, one against. Let's hear our other two speakers. I just realized we did not plan this to be a gender divide, but it's just played out as such. We're now going to hear in support of the motion, Jeffery Commission, somebody who has been a counsel for many years, currently in his capacity as a third-party funder. We'd love to hear you speak in support of the motion, Jeffery. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation. I've had the pleasure of debating with Brooke previously, back in the days when we used to travel. That one was in New York, which I very much enjoyed, and I've had the pleasure of working with Diogo and having been on a number of panels with Victoria. So I thank you all for the kind invitation. Before I get into it, I just wanted to make one clarification. We speak about third-party funding, and in terms of nomenclature, that is the term that has been adopted, in arbitration, generally speaking. But it really doesn't. It no longer reflects what I do in terms of working at a third-party funder. The term that I use when talking to clients is really arbitration finance, and I say that because I spend most of my time not looking at funding an individual case. But I spend most of my time looking at funding portfolios for companies or for law firms, or also at monetizing awards. I would say I spend a considerable amount of time, probably half of my time, looking at acquiring, monetizing awards, those kinds of transactions. So I think the market where it is now versus where it was, say, 10 years ago, it's quite different. So when I hear third-party funding, I think of one thing, but what I do is I think a bit broader than that. But I wanted to talk about a couple of things. Victoria was quite helpfully gave us a world tour in record time on what states are saying and what states are doing, and also importantly, what institutions are doing. What I want to do is talk about, all right, what are counsel, what are claimants, and what are arbitration tribunals doing? So, in the three or so minutes that remain, I'll try to do that. So, what are users saying about arbitration finance? And there, I look at what I think are the leading surveys in the space. And that's really the ICCA Queen Mary survey that's done every year. In 2013, they started asking a question about arbitration finance. And at that point, 94% of the users said that they had not used it in practice. Fast forward to 2018, 97% of users were aware of it, had seen it or used it in practice, and 53% had a positive view of it, and 35% had a neutral perception of it. So that, you have 88% of people that either had a positive or a neutral perception of it in 2018. And that's, I think, the widest survey that's out there in the international arbitration space. So we have that data point. This is what users are saying. Then we have, what is it that law firms are doing? And if you look at the latest GAR 100 survey, the results of which were released in a virtual, usually it's in Paris, but a virtual event recently, as part of that, law firms reported how many funded cases they're working on. And the number of funded cases, one has to go through each firm and pull up the information. It's not available on the GAR website unless you do the work, but the number is 176. So there, law firms, GAR 100 law firms have reported 176 funded cases. Now they don't break those down by what's commercial and what's investor state, but I would think a significant portion of those are investor state arbitrations. So law firms are clearly using these, are using funding. And now, importantly, it's not just, particular category of firms, it's a wide range of firms. I mean, if you look at the top GAR 3 firms, if you just look at their use of funding, they represent 26.7% of the use of funding. So, very, experienced firms are availing themselves either through, GAR doesn't ask if it's on a single case or portfolio basis, but one would have to presume that there's a mix. So we have what our users are saying, we have what counsel or what law firms are reporting as part of the GAR annual survey, and then we turn to, right, well, what is it that tribunals are doing and saying about third-party funding? And there, I think, I would disagree with Brooke to the, there is not widespread transparency on arbitration finance, but there isn't widespread, there's not widespread transparency on all aspects of ISDS. There are a number of orders on bifurcation for instance, that are not available in the public domain. Equally, there are a number of orders on security for cost applications or disclosure of arbitration finance that are not in the public domain. But if you look at those that are in the public domain, and you look at the recent procedural order in Herzig v. Turkmenistan, or in Tenant Energy, or in South American Silver versus Bolivia, and those are all original arbitration tribunals, or if you look at the decision on annulment in Time v. Argentina, many of these same arguments were made by Argentina to the ad hoc committee. Each of those arguments were dismissed. I shall stop there for now, but thank you for your time. And I'm happy to engage in further of these issues as we proceed in the debate.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jeffrey. I always know when Jeffrey is going to present, we're going to get statistics. And Jeffrey, you did not disappoint. Thank you for that. Last but not least, Diogo Pereira, who's going to argue against the motion. Diogo, the floor is yours. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Kabir, and thank you to everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. So I think this is a great and timely topic, and to be honest, I represent clients that often do use third-party funders. So I was delighted when I actually saw the motion because, the question is third-party funding the greatest thing since sliced bread? And I think the answer is a pretty obvious no. I mean, since then we've had the New York Convention, the ICCA Convention, the Vismut, the Internet. I think we can pretty much all agree to that. So after having won the motion, we can move on to just discuss it a little bit. So Brooke pointed out that there's a lack of clarity in data on the impacts of this. And I have everyone on this panel have the least access to that data and the least knowledge of it. All I can really comment on is my practice, which has worked with both investors and states. And when I think of third-party funding, I think of exactly what Jeffery said. This is really a question of finance, right? So, I think of third-party funding the same way I'd think of a home mortgage provider or a health insurance provider or a credit card company. I mean, these things can be very useful or they can be very damaging, right? And it really depends on who you ask and what their position is. So generally, respondent states that are responding to a claim funded by a third-party funder are not going to like it. And claimants tend to like it, though in my practice, they like it more in theory, because when they get to the details, they realize that maybe it's not right for them. And something else to think about in the context, for example, of health insurance or finance generally. I mean, we can think about, arguments in the United States over health insurance and how it actually increases the cost of medical services. Or in the case of mortgages leading to the housing crisis, right? They inflated the cost of the asset. And one thing in my career that both respondent states and investors agree on is that they'd rather pay less for legal services. So there is this question as to systemically how that's affecting the market. And it's honestly something I can't comment on, but it's something to think about. I think we're going to return at some point to the question of security for costs. And that's something that I have to say, given my experience with investigations and anti-corruption issues or money laundering, it's something that I actually feel is very important because an individual, it's in this globalized market and globalized world, it is very easy for an individual to disappear, to leave without a trace, to bring a claim. And if you think about a claim being brought against an impoverished country, that one does actually pull at my heartstrings a bit because, it is important that, if there is a frivolous claim that's brought, that a country should be able to collect on the costs, which can in some cases be quite significant. And I think Victoria pointed out excellently that question of transparency is being addressed. And I know this is something people are being talked about and are talking about, and we will talk about more. And so then the other point that, is salient from my perspective in practice is that, investor-state dispute resolution is something designed by states at the state-to-state level. They have autonomy over the process. And I think generally, the reason behind it is to incentivize and to retain investments. I think Brooke has written extensively on this, the type of investment we want to incentivize. And I can just say, I mean, yesterday, for example, I had a call with a client investing in a frontier market. And in this case, it was talking to the general counsel. And at a lawyer-to-lawyer level, maybe you might bring up third-party funding before an investment is made. But I can assure you, there is no way that lawyer is going to turn around to the board and start talking about third-party funding in the context of whether or not to invest. I mean, this is something that's, it's a very minute detail. And generally, at least in my practice, when investors are planning investments, there's a degree of euphoria and excitement, and they generally don't even want to talk about dispute resolution. And they do. Of course, they consider political risk insurance, dispute resolution clauses. They consider all of those aspects. But I'd say that third-party funding is probably not their first or second or third consideration when making an investment. All of this being said, I am not against third-party funding. I mean, it's a useful tool for my clients. And, you know, sometimes the clients are small, honest companies in large markets, in big countries that are plainly not following the rules. And in that case, you know, I'd like them to have every advantage they can, and I'd like to have every option available to them. But, you know, in this case, given the motion, I mean, is this the greatest thing ever? It depends on how it's being used, when it's being used, and really the specific context at stake.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Now, I know everybody, all our participants are on mute, so Ishan and I are going to raise our hands to each of you for your excellent, excellent opening statements. We're now going to move on to part 2 of our presentation, and this is going to be a question and answer. We're going to have our panelists talk to one another, debate a little bit with each other. While we start that process, you see Ishan has presented our first poll question. I am an idiot when it comes to technology, but I think if you click the button, somehow all the data gets accumulated magically and we will present the findings. So go ahead and take the poll. But let's start this question and answer where we will have each of our participants speak to each other. I'm going to present the first question. We will present this, potentially we have our team arguing in support of the motion, answering first, then we have the team answering against, taking it second. We will see if there is further dialogue, which we welcome. You, our audience, please use the chat feature and the Q&A feature to put your ideas. The question is, it has been argued, as you have heard, that third-party funding can give rise to conflict issues, right? The third-party funders might know the arbitrators might be involved in some capacity with the third-party funding. There could be genuine concerns on conflict of interest. How should we address these concerns, if at all? Let me also just take the argument a little further. Should we be thinking about third-party funders really as being a third party? So there's the claimant, respondent, and the third party. Should we be getting away from this binary situation really to a more expanded situation? Let me also be more provocative. Should we just be expanding it to all parties that have an interest? I'm going too far. But that's the question we have. Conflict of interest, what should we do, if anything? What do you think? Team arguing in support of the motion. Anyone want to take it? Raise your hands. The floor will be yours. And then we go against. Okay, Professor Sahani, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And so you're raising sort of the question of, in the attorney context, we think about ethics, right? This question of what is appropriate for the third-party funder in terms of its involvement in the case. We know I'll take 2 parts of this question and I'll be very brief. The first issue is jurisdiction. And then the second issue is the real party and interest rule. From a jurisdictional perspective, I think that there are some challenges with respect to including the third-party funder as a party with the way the term investor is currently envisioned. So as audience members may know, in investment treaty arbitration, you have an investment treaty, and it requires, in order for there to be jurisdiction over the dispute, that you have a qualified investor bringing the claim, and then there has to be a qualified investment about which the claim is being brought. And in most treaties, the way the term investment is designed, it's focused on investment in the host state, often physical investment, financial capital flowing into the host state, et cetera. And there's also a look back period. So it's sort of at what time did the investment begin? Most third-party funding or arbitration finance, as my colleague, Mr. Commission said, most of it happens after the dispute has already arisen. Although there are situations in which if it's a portfolio, it's possible that the investment might come through the law firm earlier. But most of it's after, and so you don't have, from a jurisdictional perspective, at the time of the inception of the investment, you don't have a third-party funder involved. So I think it's a challenging thing, even if we were to change investor and write into the definition of investor third-party funding, the timing issue and the definition of investment doesn't quite work. And so I don't think from a jurisdictional perspective, which then leads to an enforcement question, that you could pull a funder in and have that be enforceable. Now, the flip side of that is the real party in interest. If a funder is controlling the case, if a funder is possibly on the hook to pay an award, if there's a counterclaim or something like that, that is a different beast altogether than a traditional third-party funding or arbitration finance relationship. So that's my argument there. Thank you.
Thank you. Team arguing against the motion. Okay, Diogo, the floor is yours.
Yes, so I think this is a great question. And Kabir, I mean, as you mentioned, you know, you're talking about perceptions of relationships between third-party funders and arbitrators. And I can tell you personally from experience, I don't believe that at all. I mean, I don't think that happens. But there's a separate question here, which is the perceptions. And I think that we all have to remember that in investor-state arbitration, essentially what you have is lawyers being picked as arbitrators who then are entrusted with the power to pass judgment on a sovereign, potentially, you know, access public funds of millions of people in potentially dire situations. So this question of perception, I think, is fundamentally important. And we see in the investor-state context, there's a huge backlash against that, because even if there isn't corruption, there's certainly a perception problem. So in that respect, I think practitioners really should want to increase transparency in order to allay those fears and to minimize any perceived bias, because whether or not there is bias, the perception of it is certainly a problem and does undermine legitimacy of a system where you do have judgment potentially being passed on a sovereign. So I think, you know, for us who work in arbitration on a day-to-day basis, we forget how powerful that is, how magical it is in a way. But really it is something extraordinary. And with that in mind, I think it's prudent to always err on the side of transparency.
Okay, let me just offer our other two speakers. Do you have any reactions, any insights you'll want to share or join in the conversation? I see Jeffrey going towards a very sophisticated technology piece, so I assume Jeffrey is going to chime in.
Sophisticated it is not. That said, look, I agree with what Victoria has set out. I think it's highly unlikely that in the ISDS, in the investor state context, that funders will be, for jurisdictional reasons, become parties to the underlying arbitration. You know, I think it's highly unlikely that would happen. And I think, you know, there's not, as I alluded to at the outset, there's not one way that we draft a funding agreement. In some cases, again, in some cases it could be a monetization transaction. In other cases it could be a portfolio. In some cases it could be a private equity type investment, where and I've worked on, well, when I was counsel, I worked on some rather high profile ISDS cases where that was the case. So it was technically a funder that was involved, but they didn't do it through an LFA, through a funding agreement. They did it through an investment in the company. So, you know, with that investment came, you know, 2 seats on the board and certain rights of control and what have you. But that is not, that to my mind is it's hard to describe that as third-party funding, because they become an owner in the actual claimant entity. So I do think it's difficult to, and highly unlikely that a funder would become a party to the claim. As to the, you know, I also agree with Diogo. I mean, we set this out in our submission to ICCA on the rulemaking process, which is that I think it's unlikely that you're going to see challenges to arbitrators based on their relationship with funders. I say that just because most folks that are acting now as arbitrators are quite careful about the folks with whom they have professional relationships. So you don't, for that reason, there are only a few, and you can name them on one hand, of arbitrators who are sitting on boards, or some have recently resigned. And that's obviously one area, you know, if an arbitrator has a financial interest in a funder, that could be an issue, hypothetically. And the other scenario could be if that arbitrator is moonlighting doing opinions for a funder. Because sometimes before a funder proceeds to invest in a case, they may solicit outside opinions. We don't do that, but other funders do. And that's a potential area of conflict, I suppose. But it is more hypothetical. That said, you know, based on, you know, on the rule as currently promulgated in draft form by ICCID, you know, I don't think that there's anything inherently wrong with both the proposed requirements on arbitrators to disclose any potential conflicts they may have that ICCID has set out in the Will Amendment Project, as well as the disclosure or the draft language for disclosure of funding, which quite frankly, you know, it happens now in many cases that funders actively fund, in that, you know, the issue of funding is voluntarily disclosed at the outset of the case. Because you have to remember that as a funder, the last thing that we would want, I think, and I can speak for most funders, is an award that's unenforceable, or an award that is subject to some sort of challenge or annulment at the end of the day. At the end of the day, we are interested in, as is the claimant, seeing proceeds from that award. And we desire to de-risk that as much as we can. And to be aware of a conflict and not do anything about it is counterproductive.
Fantastic. Thank you. Brooke, do you have any final comments, or do we move to question 2?
I think my co-anti-funder and actually Jeffrey has made some good points as well. So no, I think the points were made.
I saw you agreeing, you know, when the speakers, I like that. I think we are potentially seeing agreement. For the debate's sake, we would like that to be more fire, but for humanity's sake, it's good when people are agreeing on things. So that's awesome.
Try to add more fire later.
I've been looking forward. Let me pass it to Ishan to ask the second question. Ishan, the floor is yours.
So probably taking a cue from what Brooke said and giving her an opportunity to fire. And also, you know, taking it forward from what Mr. Commission said and how Diogo highlighted on perceptions, where the funding is coming from, and the entire issue of how does it matter where the money comes from. So some have argued that the source of funding should not concern anyone. Why does it matter if the case is funded by a bank, by a friend, or by a third-party funder? How does it matter? Why does it matter where I'm getting the money from, if all you are concerned about whether or not I'm coming with a case that is, you know, I'm coming with clean hands or not? So if anyone would like to address this argument about the source of funding and how and why does it matter?
Brooke, take it away.
I feel like I'm expected to start here. No, it's a really good question. And I think that this actually does come up quite frequently when we talk about the definition of funding. And sort of what we're including in funding. You know, are we including philanthropic funding of specific claims, or are we talking about, you know, the more narrow subset of funding that is really profit-driven and scalable from a financial incentive point of view? So I think, you know, I think there could be, and also I would say Jeffrey also raised the issue of sort of equity investments, which are a different question as well. So I think there are, and obviously, you know, funding takes many different forms, and we can't say that a philanthropic funding of a claim would be issue-free. Clearly, a philanthropic funder also has a contractual relationship that can, you know, lead to them taking certain strategy decisions or otherwise impacting the claim. And I think that these are real questions we need to think about when we want to regulate. There is, however, in that way, this lack of, you know, profit-driven financing of claims, of portfolios of claims, where there is not an equity investment. The equity investment does align, and I realize in practice it may end up being very similar, but legally it's obviously very different and maybe better addressed through, you know, sort of reflective loss or other regulation of shareholder claims. But in any event, the profit-driven, scalable financing of claims, I think, brings into question these more systemic issues that we were looking at in our research, because it becomes then, you know, an issue of at scale, what kind of claims are being funded? Was this intended by the treaty parties? You know, and sort of how are we systemically going to regulate and address the problems that we perceive with it? So in a lot of my work, we have focused on this narrower subset, recognizing that there are also issues that you may want to address with your neighbor or your friend or, you know, Mike Bloomberg. but I do think it matters sort of what the profit motive is and to where the fiduciary obligations are. Are they to a shareholder, or are they, you know, are they similar to a lawyer where you do have obligations to the claimant itself that are regulated? So I think looking at where obligations flow is a question that is relevant to the discussion of how and where funding should be regulated. I'll stop there.
And anyone against it? I see Mr. Commissioner already spoke about it, but Professor Sahani, would you like to say something on that?
Sure. I would like to, well, first of all, I would like to say I actually think that much of what Ms. Güven said is actually very applicable. I will say this, sort of giving the slippery slope argument, crowdfunding. So there's a new thing in the funding landscape where individuals or smaller investors can come together and fund usually a single case, but it'll be hundreds, sometimes thousands of people contributing money. And the question is, if we are requiring disclosure of who is funding, and if it matters who is funding, do we then have to get a laundry list of here are the 1,000 people that contributed, you know, $100 each to this case, for example, or whatever it may be. And then the other question is, there are situations in which a financier might have good reasons for not wanting to be disclosed, just like a party might have good reasons for not wanting to disclose the source of its funding. Whether it's a parent corporation, let's say it's a subsidiary that's having a dispute and the parent corporation is funding it, and the parent corporation just sort of doesn't want to be involved in the case but wants to financially contribute. Generally in situations like that, that would be disclosed under the existing rules, but I'm just sort of, to add a little fire, I'm just making some arguments about situations in which it might be challenging. The other thing is sometimes you have anonymous benefactors that just sort of say, I really support your cause, so here's some money, but don't tell anybody who I am. I mean, this happens to universities all the time. They get an anonymous donation and they can't say who gave it. You know, what are we supposed to do then? So I think at both ends of the spectrum, you know, large numbers of people funding cases or anonymous people funding cases or entities, I think you run into a lot of challenges if you start delving too deeply into the who. I think the fact of funding is the more important piece. The arbitrators need to know and institutions need to know there is funding here. Pay attention to this case. There's a funder involved. Make sure everything goes right. More so than the who, in my view. Leaving aside the conflict of interest issue, of course, which we talked about earlier. So, thank you.
Any other reactions from our two speakers here? Hearing none. Diogo, you came forward. Is that a positive sign? That is a positive sign.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think they covered it excellently. But this might be a perfect segue into the issue of security for costs, because
okay.
I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you. I mean, our next question, as Diogo just mentioned, is on security for costs. This is something I think pretty much every speaker referred to. So let's spend some time just getting into it and teasing it out, right? Let me present the question, but feel free to talk about security for costs at a broader level. I think that is so closely related to third-party funding. My question is, you know, we have seen some states that have won the arbitration and they have been awarded costs, but the states have not been able to collect the cost award. And in some of these cases, there are at least suggestions or allegations that there is a third-party funder. So the case was, the claimant's case, the investor's case was funded by a third-party funder. And the third-party funder is per se not technically bound by the cost award. What do we do in situations like that? And generally, should we be thinking about security for costs much more deeply, much more seriously, allowing it in a much more restrictive manner, particularly if we have third-party funding? Lots of provocative issues presented here. Let's present this. I think maybe just to move this along in an organized manner, we potentially hear first the team arguing in support of the motion, against the motion, and I suspect we will have some back and forth here. Team in support of the motion, do you want to take it? I see Jeffery going forward to the sexy technology, so Jeffery, take it away.
I'm happy to open the conversation on security for cost. It's obviously something that we look at in some great detail, simply because when we model or plan on a budget for any new case, we have to think about that potential eventuality. What does it mean? What impact would it have on the budget? What is the likelihood of success? So we have quite comprehensive analytics on how likely such an application is to succeed. I mean, as a matter of fact, at present, security for cost applications have a 4% success rate. So in ISDS, you have a 4% success rate if you're seeking security for cost. And that, I think, is telling, because obviously, at least historically, tribunals have been reluctant to order security for cost absent what tribunals have described as exceptional circumstances. And even where they do order security for costs in those rare cases, and one was one earlier this year in Herzog, Turkmenistan, where a tribunal later reversed itself on that particular decision, it does raise questions about that there is no requirement in the ICCA Convention or the ICCA arbitration rules of security for costs for a claimant. And this has come out. It came out in the minority view in Herzog, where and it's come up in other decisions where tribunals have acknowledged the fact that there is no requirement that a claimant has to have a certain level of financial solvency to bring a claim. And I think that's an important point to be made here. And as to the question about there are unpaid cost awards by states, well, again, and Brooke will be familiar with this survey, but there is a survey that ICCID is available on ICCID's website that was requested by the Republic of Panama some time ago. And basically, it is a survey that I wish that, and I think everyone should be talking about, but no one does. And it's hard to find on the ICCID website, but it's a survey for ICCID member states on compliance with ICCID awards. So at the time, Panama said, look, we're concerned about these unpaid awards. We want to have a survey done, and they did. And what we don't hear about are the results of that survey. And the results of that survey are that most awards in favor of states are paid. And also that states do not always seek to enforce awards in their favor that have not been complied with. So this is a study that was requested by a contracting state, administered by ICCID, and is available. It's quite interesting. I mean, what you don't find in that survey, obviously, is details about the many awards that claimants have against contracting states that are still unpaid. That may include a cost component. I mean, I can tell you now that there are a significant number, although historically the rate of voluntary compliance with ICCID awards historically was well over 80%. It has fallen dramatically in recent years as an increasing number of sovereigns have failed to pay or refused to pay awards. So there's as big a problem about unpaid cost awards for states as there are about unpaid awards, which may include costs for claimants. I'll stop there for now, but happy to continue.
Fantastic. Brooke, your name was mentioned a couple of times. Do you have any reactions or counter arguments you want to present? Or what are your thoughts on security for costs more largely? How do you see security for costs fitting within the third party debate? Any reactions?
No, I agree with Jeffery that it seems to be a lesser issue than Panama had originally indicated. I I think there are obviously some cases where it might make sense. I don't know that it's necessarily something that needs to be uniform, which I think, again, which I guess we'll get into later, but goes into sort of how I would approach regulating third-party funding more generally, which is, we can talk about that later, but I don't think it should be necessarily a uniform situation. With transparency, I think we'd also have a lot more understanding of where the money is coming from and when a security for cost order may be warranted based on the claim and based on the claimant and the history of the claimant's behavior in other cases. But yeah, I don't have fire to bring to this one, Kabir.
Okay.
Does though.
let me ask the other two panelists to chime in here. Diogo had a comment to make. Diogo, make it fiery.
Yeah, this is
third-party funding sucks. No,
I'll try my best, Kabir. So this is something that I do think is quite relevant, and agreeing with all the other panelists, Jeffery and Brooke, it really depends on a case-by-case basis. And one analogy that I think of is, I mean, for example, you think about the criminal context, right? Somebody's innocent until proven guilty when they're charged with a crime, but some people don't get bail. I mean, they get locked up until it's decided, right? Because why? Because there's a flight risk. So I think you might all have seen, the Epstein case. We have Ghislaine Maxwell, who's, an international jet set person, very slippery. She's in jail now, and she just applied for bail and was denied it. And I think that was definitely the right decision. And if I were on an arbitral tribunal and Ghislaine Maxwell was the plaintiff, I would certainly order security for costs. So we have to remember there are people out there that are quite slippery, don't have the best intentions, and at times a security for costs is something that really needs to be considered, especially when we remember once again that respondent states will be paying awards with public money, will be paying their legal costs with public money, and that's public money that could be used for other things as well.
I mean, bravo for getting Ghislaine Maxwell in our discussion. Let me pass it to Victoria. And I think I saw a look of horror and fright in Jeffrey's eyes. So I'll probably give it to Victoria, and then we can come back to Jeffrey just to have a little bit of dialogue.
Oh, sure. No, I was just going to say that the advantage in investment arbitration over commercial arbitration is that many, if not all of the awards are public. I would say many, not every single one. And so because of that, when a tribunal addresses the security for cost question, we have documentation of their reasoning and what they and how they came to their decision. And at the awards I've looked at, and again, I have not seen everything because there have been many at this point awards, but the awards and also procedural orders and things like that I've seen, most tribunals say, look, if the claimant has third-party funding, fine. You have to show me more than that in order to get your security for cost state. Basically, you would have to show more than just the fact that there is a funder. The idea is security for costs. What is the purpose? The purpose is to protect a state against an impecunious claimant that can't pay costs. So you would have to show that the claimant is impecunious. As we know, as Jeffrey mentioned with arbitration finance, it's not just for parties that can't pay. There are lots of other types of parties that use arbitration finance, that many of them that have the means to pay. And so many tribunals have just said, you have to give me more than just the fact that there's a third party funder. So I just wanted to raise that point, and thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Professor. Jeffrey, should I come back to you and then we can take one final comment for the other team if there is a reaction, but let's hear you and then.
Yeah, I mean, I think Brooke mentioned this earlier. We don't fund everything. We are quite selective in what we do fund. So, if you look at the number of inquiries we got in fiscal year 2019 versus the number of cases that we funded, it's a single-digit figure, 6 or 7%. And if you were to carve out the investor state cases, it's probably even lower, because we do have a high threshold for funding those cases. And I would say, one further point that's evident in the jurisprudence on security for costs is that in some cases, the reason that the claimant has brought the arbitration and has been dispossessed of their investment is because of an action of the state. And it seems unfortunate that then a further barrier or impediment should be put in front of them to pursue access to justice. And if we look at the decided cases, I mean, RSM, you had a serial litigant with a history of not paying. I can understand why a tribunal would be motivated to order security for costs there. Armis is a curious decision that's been talked about a lot, but no one talks about what happened in the case. Earlier this week, there was a decision on jurisdiction in one of the Armis cases, the ICCA additional facility case, that upheld jurisdiction. So that was a case where they ordered security for costs. Turns out the tribunal found out it had jurisdiction. They ended up, I think, as I read in GAR, they ended up joining a couple of objections to the merit, so they kept that deposit. In the other Armis case, I think it came to a resolution, and they ultimately didn't award costs. So I don't know what, I think they must have given back the amount that was on deposit. So, I think there obviously is a new rule on security for costs, but I would be surprised if it changes the trajectory of what tribunals are doing when faced with these applications. I think tribunals will still require some form of exceptional circumstance.
Fantastic, thank you. Team arguing against the motion, any final comments from you? Security for costs? No? Diogo? No? Okay. With that, I think I will pass the floor to Ishan to ask our final $1 million question. We're going to solve the world problems one step at a time. Ishan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So in fact, the entire discussion has brought us to that final question. And I think the argument to that final question will sum up the entire debate today. And the question is not that long, but it's still big. What should be, if at all, the appropriate regulations concerning third-party funding? And may I ask this question first to the debaters who are against the entire motion, that what should be the regulations, if at all, for third-party funders and third-party funding?
I'll start. Diogo, you can jump in if you want afterward. I think a lot of the discussion around regulation of third-party funding has started from, this argument that it's here, and so what do we want to do about it? As opposed to thinking about what role do we want it to play and how do we shape that? You look domestically, the United States, for example, has different rules for third-party funding, whether or not you're suing the US government or whether or not you're suing a private party. So I agree with Victoria when she says states are entering into these, they can regulate it if they want. We've seen Colombia and the UAE ban it. We've seen a lot of discussion in UNCITRAL that goes much further than this issue of conflicts of interest and security for costs. And so I think when you start to have the discussion first of what do we want this, the financing of claims to achieve, and what role do states want that to play in achieving their treaty objectives, I think we might have a very different discussion than if we start from, well, it's here. What is any possible way we can regulate this, spaghetti bowl of treaties? So I do think, especially with the UNCITRAL process and some of the rule reform processes that are going on at ICCA, and potentially an outcome of UNCITRAL could be reform of the arbitration rules. Who knows? But I think there are many ways in which we could have that discussion. How do we want it to to advance treaty party objectives, and then go from there? I think the assumption that it's here to stay. Why not flip that around? Why not say, okay, is there a legitimate way that third-party funding can advance our objectives? Let's not permit it, but in those circumstances, let's consider how we should permit it. Do we have an impecunious claimant with a valid claim that we want to permit to be funded? And if so, who should bear the burden of demonstrating that funding should be permitted in this case, as opposed to how we have it now, which is funding should be permitted unless regulated. So maybe flip that. States might want to consider when they want it to advance their objectives, as opposed to just assuming it's here to stay.
Okay, I think I saw Professor Sahani's hand go up. Yes. Professor, take it away.
So thank you so much. So I first want to say I think that Ms. Güven is absolutely right. That this sort of idea that it's here to stay, and I made that argument in the beginning because I was trying to bring the fire. I know. But I do think the sort of it's happening, therefore, is not necessarily the most compelling argument. I totally agree with that. What I will say that I think is one way to approach this. Here in the United States, we have a federal system, we have a national government, and we have states. And there's a concept that we talk about in the academic literature called the laboratory of the states. So basically, when there's a new phenomenon, a new business transaction, a new technology, whatever it may be, what often happens is the federal government sort of watches from afar, and they watch the individual states and sort of see how individual states deal with that particular scenario. And then eventually, when there's some sort of convergence or at least enough widespread regulation that we need some more uniformity, then the federal government sometimes steps in and provides that uniformity. And I think something like that, I should say, before I move on, I should say that that's how third-party funding is regulated in the United States right now. Individual states can choose to allow it, prohibit it. If they allow it, how much regulation, what types of things are they regulating? Are they requiring licenses? Do they have rate caps? All these sorts of things. And that some states have no regulation at all. And as of right now, the federal government is just sort of watching what's going on and hasn't made any pronouncements. And I actually think that's what's happening around the world. And I think that that's a good model for right now, which is each individual country can decide for itself. So if Colombia and UAE and also Ireland want to ban third-party funding, fine. If Hong Kong and Singapore and others want to allow it, but only in international arbitration, not in domestic cases, fine. If in the UK they want it to be, all cases, but not consumer. In the US, you have consumer cases that are funded. I mean, everybody's sort of picking their own, choose your own adventure, as they say. There's a series of books called Choose Your Own Adventure. That's kind of what we've got going on. And I actually think that for the present moment, that's the appropriate way, because we kind of don't yet know what's the right or best way. And there may be no one size fits all right or best way to regulate. So I'm for sort of the laboratory of the states, and I'll expand the term state beyond US states, just means states of the world. The laboratory of the states with respect to regulation, I think, is the appropriate approach for now. Now, if we go forward into the future, X number of years, and there appears to be some convergence, there appears to be some norms that are sweeping the world, then maybe we might want to have something more concrete. I do think one norm that has swept the world is the disclosure. And I think that's why you see the disclosure rules everywhere. So that norm, and that's a relatively recent norm. I mean, I would say even just as recently as a couple years back, even disclosure was hotly debated. Now it's sort of kind of a given in most circumstances, at least with respect to the identity and contact information of the funder. Leave aside the funding agreement. But anyway, so I think laboratory of the states. That's my view. Thanks.
Laboratory of states, something we will remember forever.
Fantastic. Diogo, do you have anything to say?
Well, I would say, I mean, I agree wholeheartedly with Professor Sahani. And to be honest, I think that this trend in recent years towards transparency is the correct one. So I'm very happy to see that movement. So, I mean, that's it, just agreeing completely with Professor Sahani.
If I may just point out, you are sort of disagreeing with your team position that transparency is missing the point.
Not entirely, because I mean, I think the position is that I still maintain the position that there are many things better than third-party funding, and in terms of the regulation, I think our position has been winning out, which is why there's now these transparency requirements that didn't exist 5 years ago. So I think that, it's clearly, if you look at the trend and where things are going, it's towards transparency and towards anything that bolsters the integrity of the process. And I think that's fundamental and something we probably can all agree on.
Okay. Last but not least, Jeffrey, you have the world's most pensive look, pensive pose.
I mean, laboratory of the states, I can't offer anything better than that. I mean, Victoria stole the show with that one. That's going to be in my head for the rest of the day. I agree with that entirely. I mean, I would say increasingly claimants want us to, I mean, obviously we will comply with whatever rules are promulgated by the arbitral institutions in cases in which we're involved, or we're funding in which claimants are involved. But increasingly claimants that are being funded want to publicize that fact. And you've seen that just in this year, in 2020, a number of new cases that have been filed, you don't even know about the case because of it's being registered by ICCA. You know about it because of a press release that company X did, and sometimes they do it because there are certain securities requirements they have to make the announcement, but sometimes they don't, and they just do that because it is not an insignificant diligence process. I mean, it is a considerable undertaking for someone to prepare materials for assessment and then for it to be assessed successfully, so that you end up with a funding agreement at the end of it. So some claimants want to actively publish that fact, and I do think it's not lost on tribunals that that there has been, and I'll get to this in my closing, but there has been an assertion in the May paper, Brooke, that you put together that had suggested that not frivolous but marginal claims are increased by funding. I find that challenging if you just look at the data in terms of the success of funded claims, and you look at the other mechanisms available, for instance, in the ICCA system to deal with frivolous or marginal or what you call marginal claims. I think it would be difficult. It's difficult for a marginal claimant to attract the interest of an experienced law firm with whom funders want to work with, and B, to attract and succeed in securing funding from a funder, for what it's worth.
Brooke, you were mentioned prominently. I think it's just fair to give you any final comments or reactions you want to make before we go to closing statements.
No, I fully agree. I think the frivolous claim argument is not really a very strong one. I do think there is a question, though, of jurisdictional hurdles and whether funders are funding, sort of the jurisdictional phase. I mean, this goes back to the broader systemic issue, and it's slightly beside the point of the regulatory question that we're answering right now. But it seems to be that there are different strategies and jurisdictional questions that are being raised, and whether those jurisdictional questions are legal or more factual. I do think there's something there that's not simply funders are winning all claims and end of story.
Ishan,
Fantastic.
yes. About the closing arguments.
Right. I think that was a fantastic debate. And I think everything is now going to boil down to those 2 minutes each that you're going to get for your closing statements. So I will now pass on the floor to the individual speakers, 2 minutes each, and the ding coming in 30 seconds before the time ends. So off to Professor Sahani.
Thank you very much. So I just wanted to say, I think we've really talked about a lot of great topics and issues and concerns with respect to third-party funding. I just wanted to highlight something that we haven't really talked as much about, and that is ownership of law firms. So I think it's just something I want to highlight in my closing statement. I think it's coming down the pipe. Most jurisdictions prohibit non-lawyer ownerships of law firms, but that is changing. Here in the United States, we have attorney ethics rules. Typically the rule that's cited is Rule 5.4 in most jurisdictions in the US. Each individual state has separate attorney ethics rules in the US. There are no national rules, so it's something I want to point out. But the interesting thing about it is there are some states in this laboratory of the states vein that are deciding to lift prohibitions on non-attorney ownership as a way to sort of improve access to justice and access to capital for law firms. In particular, Arizona, California, and Utah are experimenting with proposals to eliminate or change the prohibitions on non-lawyer ownership of law firms, as well as non-lawyer fee sharing, which is something that is currently prohibited. And so, if you remove those prohibitions, then not only funders but also accounting firms and other types of synergistic industries might actually start to invest in law firms, which is a kind of a form of portfolio funding if you actually invest money directly into a law firm. And so I'll leave you with that as sort of the idea that the funding is going to change. Whatever you think you know about funding, whatever you think you know about the definition of the term funding, arbitration, finance, or whatever term we want to use, it's going to change. Even just in the past couple of years, the types of financial products that have been offered, the types of arrangements that have been made have changed dramatically, and there's a lot of innovation. And so third-party funding in and of itself, I think, is a global laboratory within international arbitration. There's a lot to be discovered and explored and created in this space. So anyway, thank you so much for having me, and I really enjoyed this, and I think that third-party funding gives sliced bread a run for its money.
Fantastic. And now we invite Diogo, who definitely believes it's not the best thing since sliced bread. Diogo, floor is yours.
Yeah, so I think I'll just take this time. I've been focusing very much on the micro, the individual user's perspective, but just to look at the big picture for a second. You know, we're entering a time of increased trade disputes, increased global tension, and I think investment arbitration is more important now than it ever has been in just preserving smooth relations and commercial relations across the world. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to remember just how significant that is and how significant the role of a tribunal is in passing judgment on a nation. So with that in mind, I think we should always aim for transparency. And I think these types of conversations are essential to making sure that the institution maintains its legitimacy during these trying times. And to quote both Spider-Man and Ishan Madan, with great power comes great responsibility.
Thank you so much, Diogo. And now may I invite Mr. Commission, please.
So to close, I want to engage with three of the critiques that have been advanced against the use of third-party funding and investor-state dispute settlement, that some of which were alluded to today, others have been centered in papers. One was that there's more funding in claims involving extractive industries. Well, that should come as no surprise. Arbitrations involving extractive industries constitute a significant proportion of the claims at ICCID. And the reason for that is simple. Those involve significant upfront investments of capital, whether it's an oil and gas project, a mining project, and those are obviously attractive to funders because in many cases, a worst case scenario is the claimant only gets their sunk costs. And we've seen that in a number of recent mining cases. So I think it's probably unsurprising that that's the fact. There was a suggestion that funders would fund marginal claims and that if a portfolio was used, those claims or the assessment of those claims would be less rigorous. I take issue with that, and I don't think that's not how we look at a portfolio claim, and I don't think that's how most funders do. If that were the case, then why aren't we seeing all of these funded cases being bounced on 41.5 applications? I think there are mechanisms in treaties and arbitral rules to dismiss frivolous or marginal claims, and we don't see a litany of funded cases being so dismissed. Finally, there's a suggestion that funders appropriate to themselves the right on decisions to settle and what have you, and I think this is contradicted by the jurisprudence. If you look at the decisions that have engaged with terms of funding agreements, like the decision on Noman and Tenver, they looked at that clause and they found that there was no right that was taken from the claimant in respect of settlement, and they looked at one of our funding agreements. I shall stop there. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Commission. And now for all the firepower which has been waiting. Please, Brooke.
Gosh, that's a lot of pressure. No, I do want to thank everyone. This has been a really fun discussion and a really interesting debate. But I do think that you know, with a lack of transparency, and sure, we may know numbers of funded claims, but we don't actually know, you know, until recently it is more transparent, but we don't know a lot about the funding arrangements. We don't know a lot about generally the impacts and effects of funding in investor-state dispute settlement. I think those impacts and effects are going to be exacerbated, as I alluded to earlier, in the, you know, as we saw after the 2008-2009 financial crisis. I have no doubt that that's going to increase in the coming years. So we may have greater, you know, knowledge of those impacts and effects. But until we have a better sense, I would lean on the precautionary principle. And why are we only looking to transparency so that we, you know, why are we not looking to regulate a bit more strongly and then decide what we want to permit when we know that there could be these serious impacts on the intent of respondent states and on the system as a whole? I think the legitimacy issue that has been raised several times is a serious question right now. It's been acknowledged by every country participating in UNCITRAL that there are serious legitimacy issues relating to the entire investor-state dispute settlement system as it currently exists. And I would question how third-party funding is impacting that legitimacy and how we want to address those issues. I'm done.
Wow, okay, this was fantastic. In fact, you know, just on a friendly note, I'm going to launch another poll asking in effect, whether it actually is the best thing since sliced bread. So the audience can now answer that. And we also have a lot of questions coming in from the audience, most of which have already been addressed in the debate because of the questions that the speakers have covered. So I will, in fact, invite Kabir to share any questions that he would particularly like to point out or seek answers out on.
I think we're okay. If there are any observations or any reactions that our panel had that they couldn't get, this is your moment to say it. Speak now or forever hold your peace. Any final reactions, anything you really wanted to say, but you couldn't? If any musings, we just heard that Brooke is in a farm on Wisconsin, which makes everybody who's in a city right now feel like shit in our tiny apartments. Anything you want to share, panelists, this is your moment. Share it. Jeffrey, I see you going to the sexy technology again.
There we go. I'm not sure I can live up to your billing, but I will say that there's been this, and it's a suggestion or an observation that's made frequently, which is that funding is only for claimants. And while I think that in the main that is true, I would say increasingly we are seeing interest in funding from states and state-owned entities, not in treaty disputes, but in parallel or ancillary contractual disputes. And there was one public example of that involving a certain European country and city earlier this year. And I think the copy of the funding agreement was in the public domain in a domestic news article. So, I mean, I think increasingly we states are engaging, albeit in a different way, not through treaty arbitration or ISDS, but through contractual arbitration, because you have to remember many of these foreign investors, when they go to these countries, will have to sign some sort of agreement, concession, what have you, and those often have commercial arbitration clauses. So I think you do see an opportunity for funding for state-owned entities in that context, and I certainly have. I'll stop there.
Okay. Any final reactions, any comments to what Jeffrey just said? No? Okay, with that, Ishan, do we have the results? Ishan, you're on mute. This is getting back to Brooke's t-shirt. I am on mute.
Yes, I'm on mute. Yeah, so actually now the results are shifting because, well, initially we did not have the third option, that is yes, but with some regulations and transparency. And 80% of the people polling have said yes, third-party funding should be allowed in ISDS, but with some regulations and transparency, which I think makes it more of a win-win for everyone.
We love win-win in any situation in life, so that's awesome.
Right.
Ishan, I pass it back to you to give the vote of thanks and to close our debate, the grand debate of 2020.
Well, the closing will be done by Chris, but before that, I would really like to thank each and every one of the speakers for their wonderful views, and most importantly, for taking out the time to talk about something which you anyway do a lot, but to come out with friends and talking and debating. I think that was fantastic, and in fact, a big thank you to Kabir for making this debate the debate that it was, because most definitely I call Kabir the magician, because whatever he touches, it just transforms into something even more beautiful than it could be. So thank you so much to Kabir, and thank you so much for our very well-informed audience who had some great questions and for participating. And in fact, anyone who really wants to revisit this debate, to which Chatham House rules apply, that the views are personal unless intended not to be. You can catch up on the recording, which will be uploaded on the Arbinsol channel on YouTube and will be available through LinkedIn as well. And one final word by Kabir, and then I would invite Chris to give his closing remarks.
I don't need to say anything.
$100 very well spent. Thank you for saying that, Ishan. That's my final comment, but let me just thank all the speakers and our fabulous audience. It's been, I know Zoom fatigue is a reality. I just can't believe how an hour and a half has passed. You guys were amazing. With that, Chris, the floor is yours.
there's nothing that I can really add to that. It was wonderful, fantastic. When's the next debate? Thank you, everyone, very much. It was wonderful. And Ishan, when is the next debate?
Well, it should happen soon. I shouldn't announce it right away. I want them to not be aware.
Okay. No, I'm looking forward to it. It was wonderful. Thank you all. Fantastic.